If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. But Trevor, we have to talk about your time on the Gannet. How did this even come about?
Well, it came about, I was a flying instructor. I was here at Manchester University Air Squadron, and I received a phone call one day from my desk officer personnel asking me if I was still interested in going out to Antarctica. And I thought, excuse me? He said, well, you put on your choices several years ago that you were interested in going and flying the Twin Otter out in Antarctica. And I said, well, yes, I was at that time, but I'm no longer interested now. He said, oh, okay then. And when I was coming up to the end of my time on the University Air Squadron, I was given my posting, and my posting was to number 849 Naval Air Squadron at Lossiemouth, flying the Gannet. Okay, fine, thank you very much. So I take myself off to Lossiemouth, and I'm introduced to this rather large, ungainly looking aircraft called the Gannet, which was to be my aircraft of choice for the next few years.
Yeah, it's a very interesting aircraft, so let's talk a bit about it. So what was the role of the Gannet with the Royal Navy?
Right. The Gannet, when it first came into the Royal Navy, was an anti-submarine aircraft. So that was known as the AS4. The Navy had a requirement for an airborne early warning aircraft, and the Gannet was modified with a huge radar underneath, and it would go off on patrol and mount a cap. Forgive me, I've lost the track of the correct word there. You would direct the Phantoms in air defence or the Buccaneers in some form of offensive work.
Let's talk about your ground training. Was that difficult transitioning to, I guess, a prop aircraft, piston aircraft?
No, no. It had propellers at the front, but it had a jet engine. It was an It was a double Mamba. It was the most interesting arrangement where the two propellers were coaxial contra-rotating. So our normal arrangement was to take off with both going. You get on patrol and you would shut one engine down so that you could loiter at lower speed, and every hour you'd swap the engines over to keep the oil circulating, and it extended your time on patrol. So when we got to sea, a normal recovery would be 1 hour, but for the Gannet it would be not less than 2. You would do 2 rotations, if not longer than that if required. But the training would be done on the T5, which was the converted AS4 aircraft. Interesting enough, the instructor would be sitting in the rear seat, couldn't see anything forward, and there was a periscope mounted on the top, and that was all that you had to look through in order to do all your instructing, which I subsequently found I would be doing myself.
So was it just a 2-man crew?
No, it was a 3-man crew.
Oh, okay.
1 pilot, and in the back would be the 2, in the Navy they were called observers, sitting side by side with their radar sets, exactly the same radar sets as were in the Shackleton AEW aircraft, and it was exactly the same radar underneath the aircraft as well.
essentially, were you just a pilot, or did you have any input for the systems as well?
No, you were just the pilot. You just flew them to where they ever wanted to be, and that was it. I mean, the interesting thing was that all the training was done at Lossiemouth on the T5, and then you were converted onto the AEW3. The interesting thing about the AEW3 was that in order to get in, you had to have a small ladder out of the side of the aircraft, and then there were footholds all the way up the side of the aircraft. And it's rather like the story, if you don't get the foot correct when you're getting on a horse, you're facing the wrong way. It was the same with the Gannet. If you didn't get the foot the correct way round, you'll be facing the wrong way trying to get into the cockpit.
Wow, yeah, so it wasn't even easy getting in and out of the aircraft.
No, indeed. The apocryphal story is that when Peter Twist was doing the test flying for it, for Fairies, in his post-flight report, he said, "This aircraft is very difficult to get into. I think you should make it impossible."
That sums up the aircraft, I suppose.
Yeah, which is a bit unfair. Yes, it was the most ugliest looking aircraft, but it had a quaintness about it. And the sound of those double mambas going was really, really quite attractive.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you said that you did all your flying training up at Lossie. Was that because it was near the sea? Did you do all your training oversea, or was it over land as well?
Both.
Right.
The fact that 849 was at Lossiemouth probably is purely historical, because Lossiemouth was a Royal Naval station at one time, and then the Air Force took over, and the Royal Navy were just a small little section on the airfield. But you only saw the sea. You know, there was the Murray Firth, and that was it.
So obviously the Gannet is a carrier-based aircraft. How did you start training to land and take off from a carrier?
Right. For the Gannet, there was no takeoff practice at all. I'll come on to that in a moment. For landing, on the threshold of the runway on one side at Lossiemouth, we had some white lines painted to suggest this is the landing area on an aircraft carrier. And we would just do a normal approach and thump the aircraft down into that square, and that was it. I flew to America, to Washington on a VC-10, and then went down to Norfolk in Virginia, where I saw the ship for the first time, HMS Ark Royal, and I walked onto Ark Royal, and one day we were at sea, and they said, "There's an aircraft on the catapult, off you go."
Oh,
and that was it.
That was it, really?
Into the air, yeah.
Wow, what was that like? What was the feeling like?
Well, after we landed back on, that was interesting, because we went to Roosevelt Roads, which was a US base in Puerto Rico. And I did some hot refueling. It's a bit like going into a petrol station and leaving your engine on, filling up with gas, and off you go again. It was quite interesting. And I went back to Mother, HMS Ark Royal, and shot a few attempts at landing, and then hooked on, and that was it. And afterwards, the observers who were in the back presented me with a cassette, which was a recording of the takeoff and the landing. And there was an awful lot of heavy breathing on it, and a few expletives as well.
I can imagine. So yeah, how did the aircraft handle? Because it didn't look like it could really shift around in the air.
It certainly was not agile. It didn't need to be. It had a particular role. It was quite interesting. Up in the cockpit, you felt as if you were on the bridge of a ship, because you were so high up, and we didn't have an ejection seat, but we had what they called an underwater seat. So that if the aircraft crashed into the sea and sank, it would automatically get rid of the canopy, and it would inflate your life jacket and spin you like a cork up to the surface. no one ever waited to see if it operated, because that didn't operate until you got to a depth of 28 feet.
Oh, God.
So,
yeah. So let's talk about life on the boat. What was it like? Did you fly every day? Did you mingle with the other Phantom crews or the Buccaneer crews?
Yes. I mean, just going back, the reason why I, in the Air Force, went to the Navy is that the Navy the plan was originally to get rid of all the aircraft carriers, and they closed down all their flying training schools. However, they kept one on, Ark Royal, but they didn't have the pilots for it. So they relied upon everybody else supplying them with pilots. So I was on 849. There were Phantom pilots from the Air Force on 892, and there were Buccaneer pilots on 809 from the Air Force. So, plus from the US and from Australia. So it was quite a mixed bag of people that we had on, and we all mixed together, and that was no problem. But of course the Navy had their own traditions, and as far as they were concerned, the Air Force was very much the junior service.
I can imagine.
And I will come back onto that a little bit later.
Absolutely. So was life on board difficult to get used to?
It was different. My quarters were in a cramped cabin where 4 of us slept underneath the flight deck. My bunk was actually on top of my wardrobe, and in order to get into it, I had to bring down the desktop, open a few drawers, and climb and get onto the top. And once I was lying in my bunk, there was a large pipe just above my head, and it had a piece of tape around saying steam. That was for the steam catapult. And I thought, if that bursts, I won't survive very long.
No, absolutely not.
However.
So you didn't even have an easy time. Getting in the Gannet was hard, getting into your bunk was hard, so...
It was, it was very good. Actually, when I was on, we had the BBC on filming that series, Sailor. I was actually airborne one day, and I had a situation with the aircraft. We were in the Caribbean, and I was climbing up through 8,000 feet, and the front windscreen cracked, just completely crazed over. So I couldn't see anything out the front, and let Mother know what was the situation. And so they abandoned flying, got the Phantoms back on and the Buccaneers back on. And then I was invited to make an approach. No problem seeing the ship until I came round onto finals, when I couldn't see anything at all. So I was relying upon just the idea, if I couldn't see the ship, I knew she was in the right place. And I landed on. There are 4 wires, and you hope to get number 2 wire. Number 1 was too far back. Number 2 was ideal. 3 was a little bit far forward, and number 4 was definitely not the one to go for. And you got graded. I'd had a mixed bag of landings. Anyway, in the debrief for this, Jack said, well, I've got to give you full marks on that one. So I got a thumbs up. Oh, really? And I said, did the BBC manage to get any of the film? And he said, well, no, because we thought you were going to crash on the deck. We got them all out of the way. So I didn't get 15 minutes of fame.
No, well, that's unfortunate. Back aboard safely, well, that's the main thing.
That was it.
Exactly. So could you talk us through maybe a typical day flying on the carrier?
Yeah, the first aircraft to get airborne on any wave would be the Gannet, because you needed to get off to wherever. Then it would be the Buccaneers and then the Phantoms. You would always have a plane guard, which was the Wessex helicopter, just in case anybody went into the drink. They also had the Sea King helicopters, but the Sea King helicopters were doing other things. They were doing anti-submarine work, anti-shipping work. So you would go on station, you would direct the Phantoms for whatever combat work they wanted to do, or the Buccaneers. They would go back to the ship, and then the next lot would get airborne, and you would do the same with them, whatever. They would recover back on, and you would be the last aircraft to get back on. Now, in order to take off and to land, the ship would be steaming into wind, for obvious reasons. The Gannet being the last aircraft to get back on, and the naval types wanted to turn the ship where they wanted to go, would, as soon as the last buccaneer got back on, turn the ship to wherever they wanted to go, which meant that you never had the wind over the deck when you came in on the Gannet, and you were always coming through the smoke from the funnel. It was always great fun.
Sounds like you're almost forgotten.
Yeah, yeah.
So was the Gannet an all-weather aircraft?
Effectively, yes. The way that the Navy worked, initially, when you joined the ship, you would either fly on or you would walk on. But let's say that we were in the southwest approaches and people were coming and they would practice landings to start off with a diversion ashore. And if they couldn't get on, they would divert ashore and then come back and have another go the next day. Eventually, the ship would work up so that you could operate without a shore diversion. But that would be purely day flying.
Right.
They then got into night flying, and what you would do is that you would go into what they call duskers. That was as it was starting to get dark, so it was half light and half dark, give people a chance to get on. And I was airborne, and it was duskers. The only problem was that the Buccaneers were having real difficulty getting on. And by the time I was allowed to get back on, it was night. So when I was debriefed, Jack said, congratulations, you are now night qualified.
Oh, right.
So suddenly, I'm night qualified. Now, the next thing with the Navy was that you could operate at night without a diversion. That was when it was really, really heavy stuff. The first thing that I had to get my head around when I went to the ship was the idea that you didn't have to have fuel reserves. In the Air Force, you always think about your fuel reserves. In the Navy, the fuel reserve was for you to land next to the ship and be hoisted out by the helicopter. Wow. In other words, it was total flexibility. It was a completely different mindset.
Wow, that's crazy. And did you ever work with other nations when you were on board, or was it just mainly the Phantoms and Buccaneers of the Royal Navy?
Oh no, we were assigned to the C&C Atlantic Fleet, operating out of Norfolk, Virginia. So we were across stateside quite a lot. We went down to South America and operated with the Brazilians at one time. That was interesting. That was a one-off because the Navy would operate, exercise a thing called the Simonstown Agreement. Simonstown is a South African naval base. But the government at the time said there was to be no contact with the South Africans because the apartheid at the time. The Navy wanted to do an exercise in the South Atlantic and asked if it was all right if they could go to Brazil. And the government said, well, yeah, which was quite bizarre because the Brazilians had a military junta in charge at the time, which in many respects was even worse than what was going on in South Africa. But hey.
That's great. And did you work with the E2 crews? I'm guessing it was like similar kind of platform.
In fact, at the end of my time with 849, I was assigned by the Navy to go out to San Diego on the Hawkeye.
Oh, wow.
However, the Air Force said, no, we want you back.
Oh, that would have been a great little tour.
That would have been rather interesting, yeah.
Definitely. So, did you ever encounter any Russians?
Oh, yes. We always had an intelligence gathering trawler off our rear end, usually about a mile astern, very rusty hulk. And we got very friendly, as it were. I mean, they would check on anything that we chucked overboard, like gash bags. When we were doing night exercises, we would have to have a ship guard because the Wessex couldn't fly at night. And so we would have a frigate come in to the rear port stern, and that would be the job. We were on exercise, one of these NATO exercises in the mid-Atlantic, and there was no frigate available, but we needed to be operating. And so it was decided to invite Ivan to come up closer to operate as our plane guard.
Wow.
And he was obviously very excited to be able to do that. We were excited because we could then continue flying, and that was that. So everybody was happy. The only problem that then happened was that we came into a very severe Atlantic. Everything was battened down. We didn't get out for 3 days.
Wow.
When we eventually got out, stuff had been swept off the flight deck and from the quarterdeck. But sadly of all, Ivan had disappeared. And I mean, to this day, one can only conclude that it must have gone to Davy Jones' locker.
But can you share maybe a few memorable stories from your time flying on the Gannet?
Well, I've just told you the one. Well, when I finished my time at sea, I went back to Lossiemouth, and they were short of a flying instructor. I was a qualified flying instructor, and I was asked if I would do the role, which I did, no problem at all. So I moved into the rear seat of the T5, and I was training all the pilots up. Now, you remember what I was saying about the Navy did not have any flying training schools. A decision was made that the Navy were going to buy Sea Harriers, and they wanted to train the pilots. They didn't want to train them at Honington with the Royal Air Force because they wanted it pure. They didn't want to train them at Lucas on the Phantoms because it wouldn't have been pure. However, they knew that 849, the Gannet Squadron, was up at Lossiemouth, which was naval, and so Flag Officer Naval Air Command decided that the first Sea Harrier pilots would train on the Gannet. So 3 of them came up to Lossiemouth, and of course I was the QFI. And I had the pleasure of training the very first 3 Sea Harrier pilots on the Gannet. And we had a publicity morning where we took a photograph of myself, the 3 Sea Harrier pilots, plus the boss, and that was that. That was then sent off down to Yeovilton, and we believe that the Flag Officer Naval Air Command, his cornflakes stuck in the roof of his mouth when he saw this photograph. He said, "What's the Royal Air Force officer doing on there?" He did not appreciate that the Royal Air Force, me, was the QFI. So he demanded that all the photographs be destroyed and never to be published.
But did he know that there was RAF involved in this?
Well, he didn't at that stage.
That's really strange.
However, as you can see, I have got a copy, which is in my logbook.
Brilliant stuff. So overall, did you enjoy your time on the Gannet, and how would you sum the aircraft up?
Yeah, it was a unique aircraft. I was in a unique position because I trained people on the T5, and when I was dined out, I had looked around and I had trained every single pilot on the squadron, which was absolutely unique. But the other thing was that I had one extra aircraft that I could fly, and that was an AS4, the anti-submarine version. And I used to fly that in air displays. And that was a pretty hot machine because we could do 350 knots. And I did what I thought was a pretty neat flying display where you come in at 300 knots with both engines going, go past the people with all this lovely double mamba sound and shut down one engine. So all they would see was the prop had stopped. Thinking, and then you'd pull up and do a wing over and come back, restart it, and it was great fun. But of course, the unique thing about the Gannet was the wing fold, because it had a double fold, and because the hydraulics didn't quite work correctly in sequence, if when you finished your display you came past the public, and if you folded the wings and one would salute while the other one was down. Very neat.
That is very cool. How did you get that job as the display pilot?
Because I was the QFI.
Oh, so okay, right. Was it fun?
Oh yes, yeah. It didn't happen very often. I mean, I displayed at Lossiemouth and displayed at Yeovilton.
And did you ever have, just before we wrap up this bit, one question that's popped in my head. Did you ever do air shows on the boat? Yeah, because I've seen the Americans sometimes do air displays to, like boost up morale for all the sailors. Did you do that on the Ark?
We used to have, yes, but we also had, they had a splash target at the back of the ship. On the end of a very long rope would be a raft, and that would create a little splash. And the buccaneers would drop 28-pound practice weapons on it, or the phantoms would attack it with gunfire. And we actually were asked if we would like to help out one day, and we fitted, because we had pylons underneath the wing, we could fit ordnance on there. Okay, only little 28-pound practice. And we actually won the competition one day.
That must have hurt some egos.
Yeah, I mean, that was great fun.
Brilliant stuff. So we've got a question from one of our patrons, if you're okay with answering this, Trevor.
Yeah.
Was the Gannet a more nimble aircraft in the air than she looks? I was once told by a German Navy former Gannet pilot that she was much better than she actually looks.
Interesting. She was much more nimble than you would think. I mean, the first time I got in there, I thought it was a flying bathtub. But that's a bit cruel, because you could do things with it. And okay, it was so ugly, it was almost beautiful. And the sound of that double mamba, it really was. I mean, I've flown two aeroplanes that had a very interesting engine sound. One was the Vulcan and the other one was the Gannet. Yeah. Mind you, I never forget the Olympus, because I've got tinnitus these days.
Oh,
and it's there all the time. So.
Always reminded. So do you have any hobbies, Trevor?
I play golf. I'm also a golf referee, so I officiate for England Golf. We like to go to the cinema. We like to do gardening. And yeah, generally enjoy ourselves.
Good stuff. Favourite aircraft you have flown?
That is a very difficult question to answer, because they all have their attractive bits. They all give me good memories, and in truth, they've all got the other side as well, because any aircraft will bite you if you don't treat it right.
I've heard someone say it's like your children. You love them the same, but they give you something different.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say that doing a deck launch is a very exciting feeling, and getting back on, that really was the most satisfying flying I've ever done.
Yeah, I can imagine. And one aircraft you would like to fly, either past or present?
I think I've got to say the Sunderland flying boat.
Right, interesting.
That to me sound. I mean, I live by the sea and fairly close to the Hamble, so I was used to the idea of the flying boats, and I suppose that's where it came from. Yeah, but that was before my time, so never happened.
Yeah. So obviously he had the Avro Heritage Museum. Can you tell us a bit about the museum, where we can find you online? Right, well, the museum officially opened in 2015. We're in what was the fire station at the time. We have got 603 outside, we've got 602 in here, which is one of the cockpit visits we have. We also have cockpit visits in the Lancaster, cockpit visits in the VC-10, and in the Nimrod as well, which is outside. We have some other exhibits in the simulator building next door, the Avro 707C, which we took delivery of, and we're hoping to get that on public display. We've got the Avro triplane replica, of which we've just got the engine working on that. And we've also got the biggest airfix kit in the world, which is the
Shackleton that was in the Mozzie Manchester and is now here, and once we've got our extension built, she'll be put back together and will be on display there. We do have a website, avroheritagemuseum.com. We are on the old airfield at Woodford, which is just south of Bramhall, south of Manchester, so easy access by road and by rail. Everybody is welcome. We are open on Friday, Saturday and Sunday. Private visits can be arranged on a Tuesday or a Thursday, and we're open on high days and holidays. And each year we also have a Wings and Wheels, where it's not an air show anymore, not allowed to, but if aircraft happen to be flying by to the Southport show, like the Lancaster, we always invite them to show themselves here.
Brilliant stuff. And also a brilliant cafe as well, so if you're hungry or thirsty, you can get up there as well.
Oh yes, 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 we have a good cafe there. Yeah.
Well, Trevor, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having the opportunity to say what I've wanted to say for a long time. Thank you very much.